Welcome to Mediation, the New Possibilities Hour. Today is Wednesday, July 29th, and we are recording this for premiere on Thursday, July 30th, online. The New Possibilities Hour is part of the Will Work for Food project created by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Natalie, our project is to raise money for food banks around the world. We don't charge for these seminars. Rather, if people like what they see, we ask them to contribute to a food bank of their choice. And Natalie, it's been a smashing success. About how much money have we raised so far for food banks?
Jeff, thanks very much for doing this. We are now over $45,000 in various food banks around the world, and it's all because we have generous presenters like Mr. Gerber and yourself moderating these valuable programs that our industry have so generously donated to food banks.
And thank you for your kind words, Natalie, and thank you so much for spearheading the entire effort. We have a wonderful guest today, Dan Gerber. Dan is the senior partner of Gerber, Ciano, Kelly, Brady, LLP in New York. Dan is a worldwide expert on the insurance industry. I've heard him speak many times at conferences. He's a big thinker, he takes the big picture view, and he'll be able to give us tremendous insights on his topic, myths and realities about insurance, mediation, and settlement. Dan is also a veteran of the United States Army, and Dan, we thank you for your service to our country. Dan, the floor is yours. Please tell us if there's a particular food bank that's important to you where you would like people to direct contributions. And we'd love to hear everything you have to say, please.
Absolutely. Jeff, Natalie, thank you for having me here today and allowing me to do this for this wonderful cause. The Food Bank of Western New York is my local food bank, and one that I know does a lot for the community in upstate New York. So I'll mention that one.
Thank you.
In terms of addressing things today, I'm just going to take a moment here and share my screen so that we can put the slides up that I have. And hopefully that is now working. So today we thought we would address a little bit the myths and realities about insurance mediation and settlement. So going through it from a practical standpoint and an overview of the various areas and nuances that come into insurance mediation. So let's get my slide to advance here. And that is, all right, there we go. A little bit of a technical glitch. So just from an overview, if you look at the trends, and this slide is a couple years old, but it still shows the trends over really almost a 30-year period of insurance losses going back to the 1970s. And this comes from the Swiss Re Institute. And if you look at the chart, you can see cat perils, and you can also see the insured losses grow, the uninsured losses grow over time. Certainly some of this is for inflation. But you also see the two lines on a 10-year moving average between insured and uninsured start to move apart. And what that really tells you as well from a dispute trend in what we see is over the years, insurance losses have gotten larger. So insurance claims have gotten larger. That means there's more at stake to the insurers, there's more at stake to the insurers. And that often leads, when there's more at stake to both parties, to looking at the letter of the policy, looking at, I thought it meant this, misunderstandings over, potential ambiguities that a policyholder sees versus a carrier that understands it and wrote it on a particular ISO form that knows that the intent was not to have something ambiguous in the language. All this just means that it's amped up over time. So as things amp up, we lead to dispute, we lead to litigation. How are we going to resolve that? And that often takes us to the mediation process. So from my view, really one of the realities or the overall arching reality of mediation is making sure the ducks are in a row, because no mediation is ever going to work or be successful, and if the various ducks are not lined up, and from that it really takes somewhat of a meeting of the minds, and that requires counsel, who sometimes has to reach out across to the other side and do some convincing, and establish credibility that the mediation process could work. It starts there, and so I want to walk through what I basically see as the 5 main ducks to line up here. So the first row of ducks is ripeness and timing. The second is scope. Third being selection, and the fourth being preparation, and then process. So let's talk about ripeness and timing, and this really goes to this issue. When in insurance mediation is the matter ripe? Again, you're dealing with usually sophisticated entities on one side. You may have an insurance dispute with a more regular, unsophisticated business owner from time to time, but oftentimes large insurance mediations are among carriers. They're between reinsurers and cedents. They may include a group of underlying plaintiffs as well as the insurers themselves. They may be a dispute concerning a large catastrophic underlying loss where the insurers are asked to participate in the mediation to sort out various levels of coverage, excess, primary. You may also have issues, a first party tower and a third party tower, depending on the type of risk or loss. All these issues have to be brought into the fold. So you have to look at the totality of the loss and say, what can we accomplish in a mediation? Can we get everyone to the table? And then if you can't set the full table, ask yourself, well, what if we feed half of it? Is anyone on our side going to be prejudiced if we can resolve some of this? This gets into scope a little bit, and there's a little bit of crossover between ripeness and scope, but addressing these issues and making sure that the timing is correct. Often what happens too is courts, of course, are very pro mediation, and what I often find too is we know that judges are overwhelmed. They often do not want to see more insurance disputes in front of them, and it's not just a matter of insurance disputes about personal injury. It could be a large directors and officer dispute. It can be a large first party property case, and you often don't have a judiciary that deals with day-to-day those types of insurance issues. And so a well-educated, and by that I mean educated on insurance and the insurance process, mediator often has more expertise to communicate with the parties than a particular judge. So often though, judges have early mediation and resolution as just part of the tick-a-box calendar. And unfortunately, these tick-a-box exercises for mediation are to push the parties to discuss things and go in a very early segment of the case. This is designed, I think, mostly for personal injury type cases, other small matters that are often put before a court. It's not often well suited for sophisticated insurance disputes to tell them a few months into the case, go sit down and mediate this. At least that's often what I find how clients feel. That said, I think you have to often look at opportunity, and even though it is not set up or designed for best success at a moment in terms of timing, and turn the adversity into even more opportunity. So looking at that and saying, the parties don't have enough information here, or that the other side is going to say, how do we mediate this case? We don't have all of the contracts. We don't have all of the workup on the insurer's evaluation of damages. We haven't even done an assessment of coverage of time on the risk and things of that nature. Okay, those are your unknowns. How do you accomplish and fill in those gaps between now and when the mediation will occur? How do you turn something that's unripe into ripe?
And may I ask you a couple of questions?
Sure.
This whole question of early mediation ordered by courts and the resistance that many people have had to doing those in sophisticated cases on this ripeness issue. Have we had enough experience with mediating online with Zoom to reduce that resistance? Because now people don't have to get on airplanes in order to have those early mediations. They can do them from the comfort of their own homes, or some places they're lucky enough to be able to get back into their offices. That's one question. And the other is, can we use those early mediations more like status conferences than like settlement conferences to try to determine, well, what discovery do you really need? What documents do you really need? What is really at the heart of the matter? So that people can then go and do some little wedge of their discovery rather than plenary, wide open discovery, and then come back to a mediation when they have, shall we say, turned over just one more card in that hand of poker.
I think those are spot on questions, and some of them go to a few of the topics that we would touch on in process.
Okay.
But with respect to the Zoom piece, I think the lower cost, the lower time investment adds in a factor. I still prefer to look at it, because what I often find with clients that I'm dealing with is, sure, it's less of a factor, but every hour in a day is vital to somebody in their business and what they're doing. So they want to know some level of commitment, credibility that the other side is working towards it. So I think you hit on, whether it's Zoom or otherwise. I'm going to reserve the not issues, but some of the process and mutuality and fairness things that come from Zoom and online mediation until I speak with about process on one of the upcoming slides.
Fair enough.
But with respect to getting to ripeness sooner, I think you hit right on the point, Jeff, that an active mediator can be an aid in that, and can have an early discussion with the parties about the process that gets us to that mediation date and what's needed. I'm involved in a pretty significant reinsurance matter right now. We have set a mediation coming up for the fall. The parties have agreed to exchange documents before that on an informal basis. It was apparent that the sides decided that a discussion and sitting down and having an arm's length discussion would be a good thing on this case. But it was also apparent that each side needed certain documents to evaluate before that happened. So we agreed to a process. We agreed to outline broad categories of documents that each side would need. We agreed to an exchange date. We agreed to a date after that where each side could say, hey, we think you, filled that bucket we were asking for, or we were looking for a little bit more water in that bucket. But the idea is it's not formal discovery. It's not something where you're able to, so much beat the other side over the head and threaten court motions. You're trying to work cooperatively, and in some sense it does make sense, because if another side's going to rely on something or use it at the mediation, they should want you to have that document. It shouldn't be a surprise, because that's not going to help settle the matter when you get there.
Dan, is that easier to do when it's a dispute between insurance companies, between primary and excess, for example, or a cedent and reinsurer, when people are all in the same industry?
I think so, but I think it's also counsel's job to, as I said, reach across the table and have that discussion, even if it is, you know, with an insured. You know, Jeff, I think of first party losses. It's common that, you know, there can be a large commercial loss, fire, floods. You know, we went through this a lot with post Superstorm Sandy. So I must have been involved with somewhere around 1,500 different insurance-related first-party actions or reinsurance matters after Superstorm Sandy. And, you know, we tried to set up a mediation process with many of them where we were reaching out to the other side and saying, you know, here are the things we need. We're, you know, we have a proof of loss, but we have questions on these items. You know, we have, you know, wind-driven rain versus flooding, and these issues and this language in your policy. We'd like to, you know, frame these issues ahead of time, exchange these documents. And I think that can be helpful. Sometimes, you know, you have to often look at it and know if your counsel on the other side is somebody who does a lot of insurance work, or not as well. And you know, there's nothing wrong if they don't. We all have different areas we practice in. But it's a matter of, you know, having that open communication and getting there. So that is right, because nothing is going to be more frustrating to the insurance client as well as showing up and it's apparent that the lawyer on the other side, you know, is taking a position not based so much on understanding policy language or, you know, coverage, but just based upon, you know, what they feel is right. There's always a component to that in the case, but it's guided by facts and law and contract. So, you know, I think we've kind of hit those issues in terms of when a case is right. But I think there also becomes the issue of the scope of the mediation. And, you know, one thing that's always important to understand is that, you know, mediations are confidential. Often most states have it by statute, others have it by agreement. So, you know, you agree that it's confidential, but because it's settlement discussions and considered settlement discussions, nothing can be used in court, including confidential statements said to the mediator, the mediator's brief. And I think it's important oftentimes too, from a policyholder counsel standpoint, and I can, you know, I think wear that hat. My background included several years representing policyholders before I primarily just started working and representing the insurance industry. Sitting down as a policyholder counsel and explaining the process, explaining who the neutral is and what their role is and how, you know, confidences are kept are important. But this idea of scope and getting all parties to the table is something to be examined as well. Often I think in the insurance context, and I can, you know, the first instinct of even my insurer clients will be, well, we're never going to get everybody there at this time. There is excess, there's primary, or I'm not going unless, you know, XYZ insurance comes, unless the primary is there, unless the excess is there, you name it. And I think it's important in counsel's role to step back a little bit from that and be prepared for that question, because things can be achieved at mediation without all parties there. There are you can segment issues. You can, you know, Jeff, you raised the issue of, you know, can you take it in smaller bits or as a status conference? I look at it as kind of the next level of that. Can you take the mediation in discrete bites and settle off parts of it? You know, is there a primary layer? Is there an excess layer? I was involved with the Deutsche Bank fire litigation, which was post 9/11, where there was a horrific fire. There have been books written about this case. You can find them online. You know, the Deutsche Bank building survived the 9/11 attack at the World Trade Center in terms of its standing, but the building had to come down afterwards. And you know, a tragic story made short, the standpipes in the building were turned off. There were all types of coating hazards as they were tearing it down. There was a fire. Firefighters went into the building. Several were injured, and several died due to the lack of standpipe and several other coating issues. There were people criminally charged due to the code violations and prosecuted in the case. Well, what you had afterwards is, you know, all roads eventually lead, in some respect, at least this is kind of how I view the world, to some level of insurance being involved in most issues. So you had a number of plaintiffs, a number of families who were survivors in estates and were pursuing claims. And you had towers of insurance for the owners and, you know, for the city and various contractors and parties involved. There were the issues of liability and apportioning out who would be liable. But there were also issues of whose coverage would come first and on what tower and what indemnity agreements crossed over to one another. But at the end of the day, I think there was a general belief that there probably would not be enough insurance regardless. And that's also an issue. So you can look at the legal, you can look at the facts, but there are also these practical considerations that sometimes encourage insurance mediation, which is in this circumstance, you couldn't necessarily start paying one party to the prejudice of a diminishing pot of the other. In that particular case, the parties involved Ken Feinberg, who had done the you know, World Trade Center Fund and done the BP oil fund and many others. Ken's pretty well known in this space. And we worked at different pieces of it. We segmented in discrete portions, the liability and the coverage, and worked through, you know, one or two claims at a time. And eventually, you know, some of the cases proceeded on litigation, and a lot were settled on mediation. And I think it was a good example of, if the parties had just thrown their hands up and said, it's too complicated, there's too many, you know, there's no way to settle this, you accomplish nothing. You know, I think, you know, several years ago, I was also involved in the Tennessee Valley coal ash release in Kingston, which very large billion-dollar insurance loss with issues of overlapping third-party claims from all the damage from the coal ash release into two rivers, as well as first-party claims to the Tennessee Valley Authority's property and cleanup. And you get a lot of crossover between what is sometimes a third-party claim on an adjacent property versus what's being a first-party claim, particularly when you have to do things like build a railroad into a facility that wasn't there before, so you could haul off the coal ash you're taking out. But you're now hauling that coal ash off of your property and other people's property. And what is first party and what is third party becomes blurred. And, you know, I think if you understand, I don't think I know that framing those issues in terms of when I talk about the scope of the mediation, if that issue is going to be, you know, a deal breaker, can't be accomplished, nobody wants to talk about that issue, it's just too hot going into the mediation, okay, what can we talk about? If that issue is the key, it's the linchpin to the mediation before any of the other dominoes can fall in place, let's talk about that. And what can we do to identify the documents that we exchange, the information we provide one another, so that that mediator that day is best educated to get us through that linchpin issue and then address the other dominoes thereafter. And, you know, I think in the insurance context, it's, and we'll talk about this in selection of mediator, it's very important to, you know, line those things up. I think,
and
yes.
for the mediator to play an active role in planning for the mediation, so the actual mediation day is productive.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I'm going to talk about that a little bit further in process, where we talk about, you know, what's in the brief and, you know, how you present and educate the mediator as well. I think, you know, and I'll say it now and I'll say it when I talk about process. I think a lot of people do not spend enough time in preparation for the mediation, in preparation for what needs to be shared. To my mind, you should approach it as a little bit of a mini trial or a mini arbitration. It's not as adversarial, but it is persuasive. And to make your persuasive case, you have to ask yourself, what evidence do I need to convince the other side? And by that, that means what evidence, what pieces of information do I need to provide to the mediator so that he or she can move the needle with the other side? You have to give that person the key facts and leverage so that they can go into the other side and say things like, I hear you, and they hear you. However, you know, they're having trouble parsing out, you know, what loads of coal ash were put into, you know, the rail cars from other people's property versus yours. How do we help them determine that? Do you have documents? Did you keep records? You know, help me help you. You know, so if you're framing those issues and helping the mediator ahead of time, you know, I think just to shift gears a little bit here to agreements and equality, some of that goes to setting this up, and this is also where I would address a little bit of your one of your earlier questions, Jeff, which had to do with you know, how Zoom or other online platforms, Teams, and what have you, have kind of changed mediation. I mean, right now, you know, I participated in several virtual mediations. Jeff, I know that's how you're doing things now. I've got a few lined up in the next few weeks. The platforms are working well. You can segregate people into their own rooms so that they can talk among themselves and then bring them back into a room with a mediator. You can put everybody in the same room. But what I found, and I think what has been very helpful to the process early, and what good mediators are doing in raising this issue, is bringing comfort to the parties that there's going to be a quality of treatment in the agreement. And let me talk about what I mean by that. Mediation is sometimes new, not often to insurers, but often to policyholders. Similarly, the virtual side of it is new to everybody. And you can have circumstances where, you know, right now I've got a mediation set in October. It is currently set in stone as that date, and it will go. And it will either go in person or it will go virtually. But we put some mutual agreements in it to ensure equality. That mediation is where one of the parties is located and one of the other parties is not. With COVID in place, it may be impossible come the time of the mediation for the one party to appear, and yet the other party, being in the same town, may be able to. So counsel and the parties agreed that regardless, if one cannot appear in person, the other cannot appear in person as well. Now, you know, at first there can be resistance to that, because you could see someone say, well, what does it matter? It's a mediation. It doesn't It's not binding. If one of us is there to talk to the mediator in person and the other is on virtually, we're doing the best we can. But I think it goes back to, again, the fairness of process, or how the process has to appear fair and credible, and the credibility that the mediator has to have with the parties. And when the mediator is there in person, the interaction to walk in, to look somebody in the eye, and then come into a virtual room and talk to somebody and say, well, I was just talking to them in the other room. It may work. I'm not saying, it would be contrary to my first slide, which said, find ways to make it work and work the problem to a solution. But I think that requires a lot of trust, a lot of additional communication, that it's going to be fair, and the mediator really conveying that with additional safeguards in place. I think the preference among many parties would be, the National Football League, I know, has a rule that if the coaches on the sidelines, which wear their headsets all the time, and if one side's headsets go out or there's a technical issue, the other side has to shut their headsets off at the same time, so that one side does not have one advantage, or what appears to be advantage, over the other. And I think that's what we're trying to establish here with mediations, is that it does not appear one side has an in with the mediator, even though they may not. It's about the appearance. So that takes us to the next duck in a row, and that's mediator selection. And what expertise is needed, what type of background, whether relationships hurt or hamper this, and part of the process are things I'd like to talk about. Clearly, in terms of expertise and background, I think it's comfortable that, or it's important that counsel and the clients have a comfort that there will be, somebody who can come to appreciate the understanding of insurance and the legal and sophisticated issues. I know a lot of mediators who do a great job at very complex personal injury, very complex commercial cases, but they don't know insurance. And they've been suggested to me in insurance cases, and at times I have conceded to them because it's what got us to go, just to get the date there. But it requires more up to speed. It sometimes leads to greater frustration because a party puts the time in earnest to be there and invest in the process, and they just end up frustrated because the mediator is not appreciating certain, I hate to say sophisticated, but nuanced insurance issues. One example I had recently was on a fairly complex directors and officer case. The issues to be mediated were both the underlying liability issues for the directors and officers case, as well as the coverage issues. And there was a mediator who understood shareholder lawsuits, director and officer liabilities, but the mediator was not well versed on issues of directors and officers insurance coverage. They really struggled with understanding the difference between side A coverage, side B, side C. They struggled with understanding, conceptually they knew what an exclusion to a policy was, but an insured versus insured exclusion versus an insured versus entity exclusion, and how one applied on one tower of insurance and the other applied on another tower of insurance, and how an excess policy didn't necessarily follow form to that particular exclusion on yet another tower of insurance, and how all of that would come together in forming the pot of money that I think most parties agreed there should be a pot. There are some validity to these claims. They need to be resolved. But on the back end, insurers, you had a bunch of insurers saying, we're here in earnest, but we've got some legitimate guardrails that we've got to focus with here. I can't pay, to this level when my policy limits the language here. Otherwise, I'd have to give it to everybody. And you had a mediator who I think just couldn't dial into those issues as well. And so it ends up being frustrating. And I think what's incumbent is not waiting until you get there for that, but having counsel that understands and has been through that process as well, and can have the communication I'm talking about right now with the other side. It doesn't have to be contentious. It doesn't have to be, I don't like your selection, you don't like mine, pounding tables, we're never, fine, it's this conversation. It's Joe or Jane, just hear me out for a second. Let me give you an example. Here's what I'm afraid is going to happen. We're going to get there. I hear you. This person's very good on this. Their credentials, they clearly understand this, but I'm concerned we're going to get in the room and these issues are going to break down like this, and they're not going to appreciate these subtleties. And if we have that, we just have a waste of everybody's time and money. You don't want that. I don't want that. How do we get beyond it? And I think narrowing that sometimes, can really help. And if you can't get to that final conclusion, I've also been in a circumstance where you invoke a process. So you look at it and much like in an arbitration, might have a striking process. Each side selects 3 mediators who meet the criteria that I was just talking about. They strike 2 of the other side, and then the Dow Jones finishes odd or even on a given day, and that selects the mediator, kind of how you would pick a final umpire. And I'm dealing with one of those right now. And in the end, we were okay with that because we knew that each side had come up with 3 that met the expertise, met the background, that we don't feel we're going to get there and have those types of understanding issues that I was talking about in that director and officer situation. So that really goes to this last item here, which is doing the research from your side, getting out there. There are large networks of insurance lawyers, insurance mediators around the country. It's candidly how Jeff and I know each other are through many of those networks, and then working together where you can find out information, you can vet these people. I kind of skipped over this relationship issue, but I did want to touch on it a bit. The insurance industry in particular, while being large, is also close-knit. People change companies over the course of a career. They know many people. It can turn out that a mediator who 20 years ago worked at company X actually knows 1 or 2 of the insurers involved in the dispute. They may have had a case with policyholders counsel in the past. Those aren't disqualifiers, and that might be my first myth about mediations in the insurance context. Is I think sometimes people look at things and say, oh, this person used to work for this company, they were this, they were that. Both types of relationships, those that have been adverse in the past and those that have been familial, have potential benefit to the mediation. I'm sometimes perfectly fine if I've never had a mediation with a particular mediator who I know is qualified, but I know that the other side has had 10, and I know that they have confidence in that person. If I have confidence in the issues that this person is fair and going to be a good neutral, and I have confidence in that, then I think it's a benefit that the other side knows them and has worked with them and might have even worked with them at the same company in the past. Because if I can convince that neutral of my client's position, boy, do they walk into that room with the other side with a much more credibility based upon their past history than somebody who's just new to both of us. So I think You actually have to think more broadly about that and think a little bit counterintuitively. Going into preparation. And I think this part is something that is one of the most overlooked pieces of mediation, and it might lead to, you know, another myth that has to be, this myth has to be disregarded. That myth being, we've got a mediation date, you know, we can save time, we can save money by going to mediation. This concept that you save time and money is true, but it should be with the notion in mind that it's in the aggregate. It's over the life of a case. It's over a case that might last 5 years because it's so complex. It's not in cutting corners on a complex insurance mediation and setting it up for success. That includes, you know, things like I said before, the appropriate document review and exchange and guardrails for that if necessary. It includes the time to work up strategy. That may include having an expert get on site or review the documents to understand damages. And you know, it may not be the expert you're disclosing to the other side or taking to the mediation with you, but it may be that person you need to understand, you know, the various issues in the case. Explaining all of this to the client, having client involvement and decision maker availability is just key. I think everybody who's done mediations, and several of them, has had those mediations where they show up and the other party is just either not, they're there, but they're not available. They're constantly walking out because they have 10 other things going on that day, and they have a hard stop at 2 o'clock to go take a phone call on 2 other mediations that they simultaneously have going on at the same time. You know, they can come, but at the last minute, it's going to be only available by phone and let me know if anything important happens. You know, I'm not saying that the cases never settle like that, but it's not set up for success. And if you're truly, you know, you've got this multi-million-dollar big insurance dispute, it's really about, you know, getting that buy-in from the client. But part of that buy-in is on counsel, and not just waiting until, you know, the day before the mediation brief is due and sending it to them and saying, please approve this, or we're about to serve it, and, you know, maybe we should meet for half an hour before the mediation tomorrow. It's about, the mediation is 10 weeks from now. What's our schedule? You know, we're going to have a mediation draft brief done in 5 weeks. We'll send it to you. We'd like your comment before that. We're going to work up our damages calculations, you know, a week before that. We'll send it, or you know, we'll have the expert report. We'll send it. Let's set up our conferences now to talk about and work this through. Because as you do that, you know, it will allow your client the time to, you know, put their thought process into it, and realize the importance and the meaning and the opportunity to settle it. It's not always the client's fault in those circumstances that they're showing up and they have 3 other things on and a hard stop. It's the lawyer's fault. The lawyer didn't make it a priority for them. The lawyer didn't allow the client the time and the opportunity to buy in. You know, and that really goes to the strategy, that really goes to setting up the appropriate authority in coming in. And having the understanding of how that's going to work at the mediation is important as well. I think, you know, some clients like to hold their authority closer to the vest and not even tell their lawyers as far as they're willing to go that day. I'm not the best fan of that. I'd like to be on the same page and know where my client will go, but I've been in that circumstance. And, you know, I think it's just fair to ask the question ahead of time. You know, where are you thinking? What's your range? And if they don't want to tell you, at least you know that, and you know what to operate within. And there's this issue of exchanging brief or not, and different mediators have different thoughts on it. I just think it's important to have that conversation with your client also. Some clients have a very strong preference, and then the lawyer has to bring thought and input into that too. While a client can have a strong preference not to exchange mediation briefs with the other side, they might be concerned over confidentiality, even though it shouldn't matter. The lawyer has to give input and say, I hear you, but I think in this circumstance, we've got a chance to persuade, and here's why. I had a mediation in January where this was just the case. The client was opposed to exchanging briefs. I felt that the brief was a real opportunity to lay out in very discreet manner where the weaknesses of the other side were, that they had not really thought through to that point. I'm sure they had, but they hadn't seen it set out in almost what would appear to be what a summary judgment motion would look like, what a trial based upon evidence would look like to them. And by doing that in our brief and exchanging it, I know for a fact, because the lawyer told me afterwards, that it made a difference in how we resolved that case. So it's important, in these complex, as in all mediations, but I think particular to these insurance mediations, to understand that and set it out. Understanding the playing field. This one is a pretty quick slide, and but it is important. I think the more you can find out about the mediator's approach, having conversations with the mediator about how he or she likes to run the mediation ahead of time, I think is important. Some mediators like to allow one party or the other the opportunity to have a catharsis, to present their case that day, and kind of get it off their chest. That's important for some people. It's not important for others. A lot of my insurance clients do not feel that need. I think more sophisticated business and commercial clients don't necessarily either. They're looking and trying to get to the commercial resolution. But understanding how breakouts will work. Jeff, to your question before, the virtual platform, each one's a little bit different. Each one, I've been involved in 4 or 5 different platforms, some of which were designed or bespoke to a particular mediation service, and knowing how they were going to work that, having a sense of security that when you're in your room, it's secure, or even dealing with your client and getting them comfortable with that. I had another client who, despite the breakout room, said, I'm still not comfortable. When we break out, we're both going to go on mute. We're going to call each other. And that's fine. But knowing this playing field ahead of time, especially this new virtual environment, thinking through those things, you do not want your insurance client, your policyholder client sitting there that day feeling uncomfortable by the circumstances. You want to make them as comfortable as possible with the stadium or the field they're playing in, and if possible, select it. So I'm going to finish with a few more myths, and I touched on this one before. But it is that discovery has to be substantially complete in order for there to be a successful mediation. And I just don't think that's true. Often insurance disputes have hundreds of thousands of documents, can span decades. If you have time on the risk issues, if you have latent exposures. It's just all kind of lost policy issues, tracking time, all types of documents and exchange. Reasonable minds can come together and figure out ways to do that if they're willing to work towards resolution. And to Jeff's point before, if you approach it with the mediator's involvement as well, where perhaps you have conferences where you set out a schedule where the parties work towards exchange, but they might only get so far. And so the mediator can help and say, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we get this far? I don't think you want to turn it into a full-on discovery process where the mediator is necessarily the arbitrator of what should be exchanged, as that starts to put them in one camp or the other. But a good mediator will know how to do that and work the parties through it. I touched on this already, but I want to frame it as a myth as well, just to, in terms of wrapping up, which is it's not a successful mediation unless there's a complete settlement. As I said before, I think often in the insurance context, it's helpful to take this in smaller bites. You know, take the liability bites, take the coverage bites in pieces. You know, I had a large first-party property dispute once that we were able to mediate the level of damages. We were not able to come to resolution on the actual coverage. So we mediated a damage resolution that had a high-low to it. And we made that contingent upon the outcome of an appeal that was pending in the underlying case. Now, you know, the money had been spent on the appeal. It had been briefed at the time of this mediation. And so both sides felt that they were comfortable with that, that you know, there was clearly some money that would be exchanged regardless. I think that made it helpful as well. The insurance carrier felt that it was having its opportunity to argue its contractual arguments on coverage. And the policyholder felt that, you know, even if it lost on those, it would have some money, but that there would be a fair determination from an appellate court. So you can link the issues, you can tie them. It doesn't have to be a complete resolution of all issues. Court mandated mediation does not work is a myth. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's too early, and sometimes they force your hand. I think generally in the insurance context, private mediators tend to be better, but than a judge mediating the case. But oftentimes you have mandated mediation, which you can refer out to a private mediator. You then just get into all of these tiny issues, and you go back to the first slide and start working through it and deciding, can we do this for all of those reasons now? Can we do it now? But if court mandated mediation is pushing it when it's not right, then that's really the issue of why it doesn't work and where I see the most conflict. Only elite mediators are worth the money. So everything I said before, that you have to have somebody who knows insurance or can comprehend it, appreciate these issues, give comfort to the parties that they're dialed into those issues, I think is important. That doesn't make them elite. You know, it makes them the person with the right skill set. And I think it goes to keeping an open mind on the mediator again, going back to those factors I named, such as, you know, the relationship of the other party, is it good? And working those factors in as to just, you know, are we paying, you know, $2,000 an hour for this person to resolve this case? I don't think that is the underlying skill set, and you know, I would say that's a bad myth. And this concept too, which I think you know, insurers sometimes worry about, policyholders counsel worry about if it's a large claim, is if I suggest mediation, I'm going to look weak. And you know, I just don't think that's the case either. You know, sophisticated parties have disputes. Sophisticated parties understand that disputes cost money and that the dispute exists because each side has a position and some strengths and some weaknesses. And counsel should be able to pick up the phone and explain it in a tone that, like I just did, with the same factors I just did, that you have, you know, we're here for a reason. Why don't we get a mediator in and see if we can't short circuit this? I don't put the right way, there's no weakness to that, but I think what is important, and again, it comes to counsel's role, is making the client feel that you are going to represent them zealously, even in approaching how to structure a mediation. You know, a client wants to know that their counsel isn't going to appear weak, because that reflects on them. And so that's an important part just of the representation side going into the mediation. And with that, I say thank you to Jeff and Natalie and everyone listening again. And, you know, I'm honored to have spent time towards this wonderful cause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm confident everybody seeing this, if they have the financial ability to do so, will be making a contribution to the Food Bank of Western New York. Is that right, Dan?
Yes.
Food Bank of Western New York. Let me ask just a couple of quick follow-up questions. Number one, if a mediator wants to move up in this world of insurance mediation, are there any quick do's or don'ts of things that mediators can or should do to move up in this world?
You know, I think being out at industry events where, you know, people who are involved in these types of disputes are important. Establishing credibility there, speaking at those types of events gets you out there and doing that. But that is from the policyholder side, and there's you know, more of a policyholder group in the American Bar Association. There are defense and coverage groups through the Defense Research Institute, and then there are more neutral international Bar Association type arbitration areas as well. And I think having that credibility in that area matters. But I think also a lot of it is word of mouth. And a good mediator in this arena is worth their weight in gold. And, you know, when somebody who understands, just think of the example I gave before on the directors and officers case. The people who left that room that day felt they had all flown into Chicago, 20 different parties, hopeful, only put time into briefs, only to walk out, you know, with their heads down, because it could only go so far, because they realized early that it wasn't going to move because the mediator just couldn't appreciate key issues. And, you know, that mediator had that mediator even realized that those were the key issues, and said, what do I need to do to get there? What do I, you know, need to educate myself on this? It would have been a different day. But they instead just relied on their skills as a mediator, which was, I can do this, I can do any case. And you know, that's the difference. It's the service model, and you know, which applies, I think, whether it's McDonald's or me representing a client or a mediator going to, you know, handle a mediation. You know, there is a service model in understanding what the parties need.
Tremendous advice, Dan. Thank you so much. And with that, we're pretty much out of time. Dan Gerber of Gerber, Ciano, Kelly, Brady, LLP, and the Food Bank of Western New York, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous hour. It's going to be tremendously valuable both to mediators and advocates who view it. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you. Natalie, thank you so much for organizing the Will Work for Food project. And with that, we are complete. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.